Hello, this is week 2 of the Diffusion Seminar, and today we'll be talking about generative modeling. We're forced to look at what generative modeling actually is, and then I'll give a brief overview of three major approaches that builds on it: autoregressive models, VAEs, and GANs. I'm Jihwan from IDA's lab at Seoul National University. If you have any questions later, feel free to reach out at the email shown here. So first, let's talk about what generative modeling is. A generative model is a model that can generate a new data instances. To generate this, we need to model the probability distribution P of x, which is basically a marginal distribution from the data. If we can model P of x, we can generate new data by sampling from the distribution. From the perspective of probability distribution functions, we can compare discriminative and generative models. A discriminator estimates the conditional probability P of x given y, where x is the data, in our case an image, and y is a predefined label. For convenience, I'll just refer to y as the label. Given x, we can compute the conditional probability of each possible label. For example, if we have two classes, pig and dog, the model can classify the image as the one with the higher probability. In this case, if we integrate over y, the result is 1. Similarly, for the dog class, the model can predict its probability in the same way. But what happens if a dog image is given as an input? The problem is that if the data doesn't match any of the predefined labels, the model has no way to classify it properly. The same issue arises with this weird image. It still tries to fit them into one of the existing categories. Discriminator does not compute how likely the image itself is. It only considers the probability given a label. On the other hand, a generative model works by estimating how likely each image is to appear as the data. For example, it can compute the probability of seeing this pig image in the overall dataset. It can do the same calculations for the dog image, and even the weird image. With this, we can evaluate how plausible each image is. We can potentially reject unreasonable inputs based on their likelihood. We can also compute joint probabilities like P of x and y, meaning that the likelihood of x and y occurring together. That means we can compute the joint probability for each label y. And from there, we could even construct a discriminative model. Just think back to Bayes' rule, and P of y given x can be calculated by P of x and y over P of x. So using a generative model, we can compute P of p given x, or other conditional probabilities for each class via Bayes' rule and classify based on the highest one. Generative models that use deep neural networks can be categorized based on their taxonomy. Specifically, we can classify them according to two key properties. The first is explicitness. This refers to whether the generative model attempts to represent the data distribution P of x in an explicit mathematical form. The second is tractability. That is, whether this P of x can be computed exactly and efficiently. Explicit and tractable models include autoregressive models and normalizing flows. Explicit but intractable models include VAEs, DDPMs, and score-based generative models. And for implicit models, we have GANs and DDIM. Today, we'll briefly look at how each of these categories approaches generative modeling. First, we'll look at autoregressive models, an example of explicit and tractable generative models. The main goal of an autoregressive model is to approximate P of x using a function like f of x and w. Suppose we have n data points from x1 to xn. We're going to train the model using these data points. When w star is defined as the parameter that maximizes the probability of observing the data xi, since this is an argmax problem, we can safely apply a log and rewrite it as the summation of log p of xi. If we define a likelihood function with parameter w, it leads to this form. Autoregressive models are especially useful when we treat input data x as a sequence. So let's consider x equal to x1 to xt as a sequence. Then p of x can be thought of as the joint probability of the sequence of x1 to x capital T. By applying the chain rule of probability, we can decompose this into a product of conditional probabilities in the initial term p of x1. More formally, we write it as this product. If we consider image generation, we can treat an image as a sequence of pixels. For an image with size n by n, it can be viewed as a sequence with n squared elements. So, we are dealing with a joint probability of a sequence of length n squared, and we can build a generative model based on that. A natural approach in this case would be to use RNN that models the probability of each pixel conditioned on the previous pixels in the sequence. Pixel RNN models the distribution of the next possible pixel conditioned on all previously generated pixels and generated new pixels sequentially based on that, and so on. Like this. However, this approach is extremely slow. For 256 by 256 images, it requires 65K steps to generate. And if we add more channels or increase the resolution, it becomes even slower. To mitigate this problem, pixel CNN was proposed. It generates each pixel by only considering the surrounding context. Pixels that haven't been generated yet are masked, so the model can see them. It uses a stride of 1, generating each pixel conditioned on nearby pixels. Like this. Because each pixel depends on local context, pixel RNN allows partial parallelization, which makes it somewhat faster in practice. However, the total number of generation steps remain unchanged. So in the end, the model is still very slow for high-resolution images. In this figure, the leftmost image shows the occluded input, and the rightmost image is the original. The middle columns shows the model's outputs generated by conditioning on the upper half of the image. And you can see that it produces multiple variations. These are samples from Cypher 10 dataset. And while it's hard to say exactly what they are, you can see that something with an object-like shape is formed in image space. There are also many approaches using transformer-based architectures for image generation. In particular, VAR, which won the Best Paper Award at Generative 2024, is designed to be autoregressive, but it models sequences at the resolution level, not at the pixel level. We'll move on to explicit but intractable models and take a look at one example, the variational autoencoder or VAE. A standard autoencoder, not the variational one, is a model that aims to learn a good latent representation of Z of an image in a self-supervised way without labels. It consists of an encoder on a latent vector Z and a decoder. We can encode this dog image using encoder F into a latent vector Z and then reconstruct it. If the reconstruction is good, we can assume that the learned Z captures meaningful features of the image. The loss is computed using L2 norm between the original image X and the reconstructed image X hat. Then, can we use this to generate new data? If we remove the encoder, we are left with just the decoder. So if we can generate a proper latent vector Z, we could feed it into the decoder to generate a new image. The problem is we don't know the distribution of Z. But if we could design Z to follow a known distribution, like a Gaussian distribution, then we could simply sample Z from that distribution and generate images. That's the key idea, and it leads to a structure like this. Now, if we can sample a latent vector Z, we can use the decoder to generate new images. But how do we train p theta of X given Z? Just like before, we want to maximize p theta of X. Since Z is latent, we express p theta of X as the integral over all possible Z values. Basically, sample Z from P of Z, then generate X from P of X given Z. Let's look at the expression. The first term, P of Z, is easy to compute. It's usually a standard Gaussian. The second term, P of X given Z, is something we can compute using the decoder. The problem is we need to integrate over all possible Z, and Z is typically high dimensional, at least 64 dimensions or more. This integral becomes intractable in practice. What if we take a Bayesian approach? The numerator is still manageable, just as we discussed. But the denominator term, the posterior probability P of Z given X, is unknown, and that's the core problem. We approximate the intractable p theta of Z given X using another function, Q phi of Z given X. how do we approximate it? The approximation is done by the encoder, which now learns to output a distribution, not just a fixed vector. So the overall architecture of VAE looks like this. Compared to standard autoencoder, but the encoder and decoder are now probabilistic models. It's because instead of producing a fixed z or x, we want to learn a distribution and then sample from it. So now, how do we train this? Similar to what we discussed earlier, we still aim to maximize the likelihood of P of x. Since the log function is monotonically increasing, we can optimize log P of x instead of P of x. By Bayes' rule, we can rewrite the expression in this form. And we multiply both the numerator and denominator by the same Q of c given x. Using log properties, we can decompose the expression into multiple terms. We then take the expectation over c, which follows Q of c given x for each term. The left side, log P of x, remains unchanged because it's marginal over c. By the linearity of expectation, we can separate the expression into three distinct terms. Using the definition of KL divergence, we can express the second and third expectation terms as KL terms between the relevant distributions. The first term corresponds to the data reconstruction error. It computes the log probability of reconstructing x from a z inferred by the encoder. The second term is the KL divergence between the encoder's output Q phi of c given x and the prior P of c, which is typically a fixed Gaussian distribution. Since both distributions are simple Gaussians, this term has a closed form solution. The last term is the KL divergence between the approximate posterior Q phi of c given x and the true posterior P of c given x. But we cannot compute this because P of c given x is intractable. As mentioned earlier, P of c given x requires computing P of x, which involves integrating over all z, which is a very difficult problem. However, since KL divergence is always non-negative, we know that log P of x is lower bounded by the other two terms. This is why we call it as the evidence lower bound, or simply elbow. As you can see in the figure, the elbow acts as a lower bound to the true log marginal likelihood. So by maximizing the elbow, we can approximate the minimum of the marginal likelihood. This figure shows images generated by VAE trained on the MNIST dataset. As you can see, the outputs closely resemble real digits. One interesting observation is that a latent variable z captures high-level features of the data. In other words, z encodes semantic information in the latent space. In this figure, we sample a few z vectors at the edges and then linearly interpolate between them. As a result, we can observe smooth transitions in features. For example, phasor expressions on the left, or digits, gradually change from one class to another on the right. In the final section, we'll look at generative adversarial networks, an example of an implicit generative model which does not explicit model P of x. Unlike VAEs, we don't define a likelihood function. Instead, we start a simple latent distribution Z, typically a standard Gaussian. Then we use a neural network G, the generator, to map Z into a generated image. But here's the problem. Without modeling P of X, how do we know if the generated image is realistic? The answer is, if we cannot distinguish the fake image from real data, then it must be a good sample. To measure that, we introduce a second network, the discriminator. Its job is to distinguish between real images and generated ones. The overall structure of GAN looks like this, and we sample a latent vector Z from a simple prior, pass it through the generator G and get a fake image, and then the discriminator D compares it with real images from the training set and tries to determine whether it's real or fake. The discriminator's objective is straightforward: to distinguish fake images from real ones. To train it, we can simply treat it as a binary classifier. On the other hand, the generator's objective is to fool the discriminator. In other words, to generate images that are realistic enough to be classified as real. The learning signal for the generator comes from the discriminator, and if the generated image is convincing enough to trick the discriminator, the generator is rewarded. But if the discriminator can easily tell it's fake, that means the generator has produced a bad sample, then the loss increases accordingly. This adversarial training process can be expressed mathematically as follows. Let's take a closer look at the objective function. Starting from the discriminator's objective, the goal is to maximize the entire expression with respect to discriminator's parameters theta sub d. To do this, the discriminator needs to maximize the first term and minimize the second term. Recall that the output of d of x is bounded between 0 and 1. If you look at the log graph, the first term increases as the value gets closer to 1. For the second term, since it's log 1 minus x, the value increases as x gets closer to 0. In the first term, x refers to a real data sample. So the discriminator is trained to output a value close to 1 when given a real data. In the second term, g of c is a fake sample by the generator. The discriminator is trained to output a value close to 0 when given a fake data. Now let's move on to the generator's objective. Unlike the discriminator, the generator has a conflicting goal, so we try to minimize the entire objective function. The first term, log d of x, is independent of the generator, so it can be ignored when optimizing the generator. The second term contains log 1 minus d of g. Since the generator wants to minimize this term, the optimal case is when d of g of c is close to 1. In other words, the generator is trying to produce g of z that looks so real that the discriminator outputs a value close to 1, just like for real data x. This diagram illustrates the training process of a GAN. We have latent space Z and data space X. The green solid line represents the generator, which maps Z to X. Initially, the generator's output distribution is far from the true data distribution, which is shown as the black dotted line. Because of this gap, the discriminator, shown as the blue dashed line, assigns higher probabilities to real samples on the left and lower probabilities to the fake samples on the right. As training progresses, G of C gradually gets closer to the real data distribution. Ideally, the generator will eventually match the true data distribution, making it impossible for the discriminator to distinguish real from fake. Once the generator becomes perfect, the discriminator can no longer tell which distribution a given sample X comes from. These are again generated samples from MNIST and the Toronto phase dataset. The rightmost column shows the nearest real training example. As you can see, it generates realistic looking images and to the point where we cannot even tell which ones are real. As with VAEs, we can observe feature interpolation in GANs by linearly interpolating between points in the latent space. This interpolation property also appears in more complex high-dimensional images. For example, in the big GAN papers, we can see smooth transitions even in high-resolution outputs. Later, GANs were extended to generate very high-resolution images. One notable example is style GAN, where all faces shown in this figure are actually generated samples, yet they look highly realistic. In style GAN, it was also shown that we can extract style vectors entangled in Z and combine them to control different visual attributes. Here, the facial features from the left column are transferred onto the faces in the top row. Furthermore, by learning mappings between unpaired domains with cycle consistency, CycleGAN enables style transfer without needing explicit latent spaces. Alright, that wraps up today's seminar. We briefly explored the idea of generative modeling and looked at three major approaches: autoregressive models, VAEs, and GANs. If you're interested in learning more, here are some recommended resources. Much of today's contents were inspired by these works. Thank you for listening.